Namaste, everyone, and welcome back to the Ramayana Odyssey Podcast. In this podcast, we journey through the Ramayana one story at a time. And the way we do this is by listening to the story first, and then in the following episodes, we take the moment to pause and reflect on its deeper meaning, alongside explore how its wisdom applies to our lives today. So, in our last story, we arrived at a very beautiful and sacred turning point throughout the Ramayana tradition. Maharshi Valmiki ji, after having received the divine vision of Rama's life, composed the Ramayana in sacred verse. But the story didn't end there because the Ramayana was not meant to just remain hidden in the heart of Valmiki ji alone. It had to be heard. It had to be sung. It had to be carried into the world. And that is where Lava and Kusha enter the sacred journey. Under Maharshi Valmiki's guidance, they became first voices to carry the Ramayana. They learned not only its words, but also its rhythm, its feeling, its devotion, alongside its dharmic spirit. And for me, that's what makes this story so unique in this nature. This episode is not only about the composition of the Ramayana, it's also about transmission. It's about how sacred wisdom moves from one heart to another. It's about how a divine vision becomes poetry and how poetry becomes a kind of teaching and how teaching becomes a living tradition. So today, I want to take the time to reflect on this very moment a little bit more deeply. So, what does it mean that Maharshi Valmiki did not keep the Ramayana to himself? Why were Lava and Kusha specifically chosen to be the first voices of the Ramayana? What does this teach us about teachers, students, youth, and sacred knowledge in general? And how does this story speak to us today? So, one of the first things that really stands out to me is the fact that Maharshi Valmiki does not treat the Ramayana as something to be privately possessed. Rather, he received it as something sacred. And he has received this vision of Rama's life. He composed it into shlokas, but he also remembers that a scripture is not meant to remain hidden. A sacred story such as the Ramayana is not only meant to live in the memory of the sage who composed it. It has to travel. It has to be heard. It has to be shared. And it must move from heart to heart. And this teaches us something so important about sacred knowledge in general. Spiritual knowledge is one of the greatest treasures that are bestowed upon human beings, and it is the greatest thing someone can possess. Because it's not knowledge just for the sake of argument, and it's not knowledge only for the sake of learning more scholarship. Rather, it's knowledge that helps us live better. It helps us think clearly. It helps us act properly. And it really helps us understand what we are. And by doing so, we can also understand others. And with all of this combined, it really helps us grow spiritually. In our tradition of Sanatana Dharma, sacred knowledge supports the very goals of human life. It gives direction to material life. It gives refinement to emotional life. It gives stability to ethical life, and it gives depth to spiritual life. And one of the most beautiful things about this kind of wealth is that it doesn't reduce when it's shared. If we give away money, it reduces in number. If we divide property, it gets divided. But if we share wisdom, it grows. It grows in the listener. It deepens in the person who shares it, and it begins to benefit more and more lives. And this is why Maharshi Valmiki does not keep the Ramayana to himself. He understands that truth is not meant to be hoarded. It's meant to be transmitted with absolute care, responsibility, and humility. But there's also a very important caution here. Sharing sacred knowledge should never become fanaticism. And what does that even mean? It's basically when somebody says, my scripture alone is true, my path alone is valid, and everything else is wrong. This is not the spirit of our tradition of Sanatana Dharma. And in fact, we embrace all of the different interpretations that come around it. This is one of the greatest beauties of our tradition. It encourages us to seek truth, live truth, and share truth without any narrowness, arrogance, or exclusivity. It really allows us to stand firmly in our own tradition while retaining openness, humility, and respect. So this story really shows us that sacred knowledge is precious. It is transformative and it should be shared, but it should always be shared with humility and never with arrogance. Now, the second thing that really stands out to me is that Lava and Kusha were very young. They weren't kings, they weren't famous scholars, or they weren't powerful leaders. They were two young students in an ashram. And yet, despite their age and their stance in the ashram, they became the first voices of the Ramayana. I think this is one of the most beautiful parts of the story because it tells us that age is not a barrier. So today, I've personally seen a lot of people assume that sacred learning, philosophy, scripture, and deeper reflection of these things are things that only come to people much later in their lives. But Lava and Kusha are evidence of the fact that age is not a constraint in learning all of these. They are young, they're innocent, but yet they are capable of receiving such sacred knowledge and also showing it to the world. This is something that is so meaningful to me because I think that many young people today are actually searching for something deeper. One of the most popular questions in Gen Z is trying to figure out who you are and discovering yourself just through whatever means possible. So they are searching for meaning. They're searching for direction. They're searching for strength. And they might not have the proper language to do so, but they are searching for the exact same thing despite their age. Searching for something stable in a fast changing world is automatically such a big thing. So when I think of Lava and Kusha, I feel like this story is telling people my age and younger that you aren't too early and you aren't too young. And sacred wisdom is not beyond anybody's reach. If it's received properly with open hands, young people, alongside people anywhere in their lives, can carry something eternal with sincerity, beauty, and strength. And that is such a powerful message because traditions do not survive only because of the older generations that preserve it. Rather, tradition survives and thrives, in fact, when younger generations receive it, love it, understand it, and provide it with a voice again that fits the modern era. Lava and Kusha became the first voices of the Ramayana. And in some way, every generation is invited to become a voice for Dharma again. Now, another really beautiful part of this story is the way that Maharshi Valmiki ji teaches them. He doesn't simply hand them a book and say, memorize this, learn it. He doesn't merely just teach them the words that were written down or the words that came to him. He teaches them the sound, the rhythm, the meaning, the feeling that belongs with it. He teaches them where the voices should become soft, where it should become firm, where it should carry some grief, and where it should carry wonder, and where it should rest in devotion. That is a very powerful image of a true teacher, because a true teacher doesn't simply complete a checklist, like you have to learn X, Y, and Z. A true teacher does not merely say, "Oh, I'm done teaching." Rather, a true teacher ensures that the student actually receives what is being taught. Not just information, but the meaning that goes along with the information. In this case, not just words, but the spirit that goes along with the words. Not just the actual content, but the right orientation of the content. And that is why in our tradition, we use the word Sampradaya. This means that knowledge is handed down properly, not casually, not in part, not carelessly, not in a distorted way, but properly in the right form, through the right means for the right student, so they can truly receive it. And that is exactly what we see in Maharshi Valmiki. He is not only teaching Lava and Kusha to repeat the Ramayana, he's teaching them how to carry it with them. He's not transmitting just text, but a living tradition, and this is so evident in their voices. This is something that applies even beyond scripture, actually. In education, parenting, mentorship, leadership, a real guide, psychologically, does not stop with instruction. A real guide takes the time to ensure formation. They not only care about what is said, but also how it's received. A real guide can tailor the same information to the exact student that they're teaching. And that is what we see Valmiki doing. He is shaping the first singers of the Ramayana. Now, this story also shows us why song, rhythm, and story are also very powerful. From a psychological perspective, for example, I find this very interesting. This was what jumped out at me because human beings really, it's difficult for us to remember a series of facts that are thrown at us. Rather, it is much easier for us to remember how we feel. For example, if we look at a time where we were upset, we might not necessarily remember what made us upset, but we remember we were upset and how we felt. Emotions are much easier to remember than words or fact alone. And this is just how our minds operate. With this, Valmiki was really able to transform his words to Lava and Kusha to just convey this emotion. They weren't just memorizing lines. The Ramayana was entering them and their voices. It entered their memory, it entered their hearts, and again, from a psychological standpoint, this makes perfect sense. Music and rhythm also really helps us remember things. They often say if you want to remember something, to make it into a rhythmic tone, like a phrase or something that you want to remember. And alongside this, narrative creates meaning and embodiment makes learning last. Which is why oral traditions remain so powerful even today, because they don't just preserve information. Like if you're reading a book, you can't necessarily feel every single word, but oral traditions preserve feeling, inner orientation, and life. And maybe this is one of the reasons why the Ramayana continues to live so deeply in everybody's hearts today. It wasn't just written to be understood at surface level. It was shaped to be heard, sung, remembered, and lived. And then there's the deeper spiritual transformation in this entire journey that we see. Now, this arc with Valmiki ji began with his grief beside the Tamasa River. Maharshi Valmiki saw the sorrow of the bird, and out of this sorrow came the first shloka. Then Brahma came by and revealed the purpose of his words coming out the way they did. And with this knowledge, he was able to compose the Ramayana. And now we see Lava and Kusha become its first voices. Sorrow becomes a shloka. The shloka becomes the Ramayana. And the Ramayana now found its voices. This is really quite extraordinary. And spiritually, it also conveys a very deep message in that grace can very much easily transform anything that is painful to wisdom. Compassion can turn into a culture moment, and a moment of individual sorrow can become a blessing for generations. What began as one sage's experience beside a river witnessing two birds never remained private. Through tapas, grace, and sacred receptivity, it became something absolutely universal. And I feel this is also how spiritual life works. When suffering is only left at the level of ego, it remains as pain. But when it's purified through reflection, grace, and truth, by going to Bhagavan and seeking insight, it can become insight and it can turn into knowledge. And when this insight is offered for the good of others, it becomes sacred service to Bhagavan. And that is exactly what has happened here. Grief did not remain grief. It turned into a vehicle for Dharma. Something that looked so painful now carries Dharma to millions of people across the world for generations on end. And this brings me now to what this story means for today's generation, for those that are my age. Don't think of sacred wisdom as something ancient. And don't think you're too young to start thinking about. And don't think that tradition survives automatically. Tradition requires effort. It requires each generation to give the same story a voice again in the times that are modern at that point. Lava and Kusha were not passive receivers. They became carriers. They learned, they absorbed, they sang. And through them, the Ramayana began to enter the world. Valmiki composed the Ramayana, but we never would have known it existed if it weren't for Love Kush. And this is such a powerful message for us today. If something is meaningful to you, if something is beautiful, if something had the power to guide you through life, then don't just admire it yourself from a distance. Rather, you should learn it and share it with others. By doing so, you're not only doing them a service, but you're also doing yourself a service. Because again, like I said before, the best way to ensure you learned something is by teaching others yourself. Now, we need to take a moment and decide if we will let wisdom remain distant or if we want to give it a voice again. And this story really gives us a hopeful answer. Our generation is so incredibly smart. We can see it in the numbers of our IQ tests and our EQ tests. And this is something that is quite overlooked because of our age. But the fact is, you can be voices for anything you want. You can become the voice of Dharma. And this is so incredibly inspiring. So, from this entire conversation that we had, if I had to take one message from this, I would say you are not too young to begin. Your age does not matter at all for doing anything sacred. Your age doesn't stop you from asking deep questions. You are not at a point where you cannot carry something meaningful. And this doesn't just apply to young people. It applies to anybody who thinks that their age is a restriction to their learning. This is something that is meant for everyone. Sanatana Dharma is so unique in that it lets us live our daily lives in our jobs, our education, while also embodying these like scriptures. So you're never the wrong age to study. So the question for us at this point would be, what wisdom have I received? And how am I preserving it? How am I living it? How am I passing it on responsibly? And this is something we can do with the knowledge we have because age doesn't matter in that sense for learning. The Ramayana is not meant to be just read. It has to be lived and carried forward. And this is what Lava and Kusha started for the entire world. And this is exactly what each generation must continue in its own way, not just for the Ramayana, but for any piece of information they find significant. Thank you so much for being with me in this reflection. This episode feels very beautiful to me because it reminds us that sacred wisdom is not meant to be hidden. People often get afraid when they hear the word sacred, but it's meant to be received, cherished, and carried forward with love and responsibility. And Lava and Kusha show us this with their beautiful example of spreading the Ramayana despite their young age. Now, if this episode was meaningful to you, please do take the time to share your thoughts with us in the comments. And also feel free to, of course, share this episode with anybody else who may benefit from listening to it. And you can also follow the Ramayana Odyssey podcast on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcast. And if this journey is meaningful to you, please help us take the message of the Ramayana to more seekers. Until next time, let's keep listening deeply, keep reflecting sincerely, and keep walking this sacred path together. Jai Shri Ram.